Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, StayNTouch Cloud PMS, Configuration and User Training Series, Revenue Management, presented by StayNTouch Implementation Consultant, Chris Devlin. I'm your host, Erin Fisher, the content writer here at StayNTouch. Today's presentation will explain how to use the revenue management functionality in StayNTouch Cloud PMS. In this webinar, we will cover the following topics: the rate manager, which includes hierarchy restrictions, availability, and setting rate amounts, cell limits, events, company and TA cards, and contract management. We will have a short Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation, and we will answer them in the order they are received at the end. And that's all I have right now. Chris, I'm going to hand the presentation over to you.
Thank you so much, Erin. Okay, perfect. So we should be seeing my screen now, and I'm going to go ahead and start taking us through the topics for today. So much of what we'll be doing today is going to be revolving around our revenue management menu options. So we'll be starting in the rate manager. We'll also be looking in company TA cards, cell limits, and events. So really everything that we have under here we'll be taking a look at today. And we're going to start in the rate manager. So I've already activated for my property hierarchy restrictions. And if you're wondering what hierarchy restrictions are, the main advantage behind the hierarchy restrictions concept is that because the restrictions are saved on hierarchy levels and not on rate and room type combinations, the hierarchy restrictions reduce database impact quite a bit. And moreover, as you add new rates, if rates fall within the restriction dates that you've set in these hierarchy restrictions, they'll automatically be restricted per the rules that you've set in those hierarchy restrictions. So you don't have to add those manually as you add new rates. That's one of the real benefits of them. Just as a bit of a note before we dive into this though, the external systems using the hierarchy restrictions do need to go through a certification process to support these restrictions. So there are some that are active now, such as Synexus and Windsurfer, and some that are going through the certification and pilot phase, such as SiteMinder, Vertical Booking, and iHotelier. So based on the CRS integration you're working with, it may or may not be supported at this point. So there's something to bear in mind. But let's dive in and take a look at how this actually looks and how it works. So I'm in the rate manager, and the first thing we're going to do is select our date range. I'm just going to move through the 30th of April, and I'll leave it on rates. I'm not going to select a specific rate. We'll just actually show all rates. So this is going to list out all rates for my property. And along the top of the screen, what you'll see that might be a little different if you don't currently have this active for your property is you'll see this line that says house. And there's a little tab in the center here. And if I expand this tab out, this will show me the different levels of hierarchy restrictions that are available for me to use. So it works in a tiered level, the least restrictive being a rate restriction, then on top of that, a rate type restriction, then more restrictive being a room type restriction, and the most restrictive being a house restriction. So the concept being, if you put a house restriction on, that will override or supersede all other restrictions that are below it. So visually, this kind of corresponds with how these work in effect. So if I place a house restriction, that's going to supersede any room type restrictions that might be there, any rate type restrictions, any rate restrictions. If I place a room type restriction, similarly, that will supersede any rate type restrictions or any rate restrictions. So the least restrictive is a rate, and then you have rate types and room types and so on. So we're going to go through some of these to see some examples on how these will work. We're going to pick on a date. I'm going to choose April the 1st as my date to pick on, and I'm going to do a house restriction simply by clicking into this button here, into this box, and I'm going to set a restriction. No restrictions currently, and I can set a restriction here. I'll choose my restriction from the restrictions I have active for my property. And in this case, we're going to choose closed. So I'm closing the house for this particular day. If I wanted to repeat this restriction, you see we have the option here to repeat on specific days. I can push this out to a particular date range if I wanted to. And if I wanted to be specific on just particular days of weeks, maybe just Fridays and Saturdays, for example, I can choose days of weeks, a specific pattern, and choose my end date, and it'll apply that restriction to those dates that we want it to be repeated on. For this one, I'm just going to choose the 1st of April. We'll just set this one date particularly, and I'm going to set that restriction. So you can see we can set more than one house restrictions if we needed to. Closed is pretty strong, so there's probably not more restrictions than we need to put on for that. So we'll leave it with just closed. And I'm going to toggle over to my availability screen or to my reservation screen, and we'll look at how this actually shows when we try to make a reservation for April 1st for one night. Nothing is showing up. If I click on show restrictions, house restriction in effect with closed. Again, at the bottom of the screen, we have our legend that shows the different restriction types. And you'll see that because we put that house restriction in effect, all of our rates that we see in our general availability are closed for us. So now I'm going to go ahead and remove my house restriction. And let's take a look at our room type restrictions. We'll keep working on April 1st. And if I click into room type, here, for example, we could close out specific room types or do minimum length of stay restrictions, for example. So let's say we're going to close, and here I can search for room types, or I can scroll down and see the room types I have available for my property. And if I wanted to close my park view rooms, for example, I can choose those. Park view king, park view queen, and then I can go ahead and set. So I've closed those two. I could also do different restrictions for different room types. I could do a minimum length of stay on a different room type, for example. So there's lots of options. You're not restricted to just one type of restriction on a given date for room types there. But if we close out of there, now we'll see on that same date range, and if I go into my standard daily rate, these are the room types available. If I show restrictions, we'll see that those two room types have been closed out because of the hierarchy restriction in place. Let's go ahead and remove that. And now we have rate type restrictions. So if I put a rate type restriction in place, this is a really useful way for us to basically close out an entire group of rates at once. So if we've grouped our rates together by buckets such as discounted rates, OTA rates, corporate rates, for example, this is a way that we can put a restriction such as closing, minimum length of stay, for example, on a rate type. So again, in my general availability here, if I now take a look, I can see that I have my standard daily rate, but I also have a couple of discount rates there. I got my AAA rate and my prepay and save rate. So if I want to choose to close out my discounted rates, I can click into rate type, set a restriction, and we could do close to arrival, for example, something different. And in my rate types here, I have some examples of contract and corporate, discount group retail. I'm going to choose discount rates, and we'll go ahead and set that there. So now if I do that same rate query, only my standard daily rate is showing, because as expected, my discount rates have been closed out based on that restriction. And then last but not least, we also have our rate restrictions. Let me just go ahead and remove this one first. And in our rate restrictions, this is where we can choose a restriction such as max length of stay, let's say 4 nights, for a particular rate code. So let's say we want to say we can only stay for 4 nights if we're booking AAA on this particular date. And we can set that here and close it out. Now, if I scroll down to my AAA rate, because I'm actually on my rate display screen, you'll see that that's actually being applied to this particular rate on that display. So you will see that listed on the display as well. Let's go ahead and remove that. So what's important to note here is you might have rate codes, for example, where you already have a predefined minimum length of stay, for example. So if you have a minimum length of stay on a rate code for 3 nights, and you put a house restriction for a minimum length of stay of 4 nights, that house restriction will supersede the rate restriction. So even though you have a rate that says a minimum length of stay of 3, if the house has a 4-night minimum length of stay, that will be the restriction that is governing the policy for the house. So that's basically the way that this is going to work. Always the most important or the superseding one is on top here. Again, if you want to activate this for your property, your best option is to reach out to your CSM or to the support team, and we can have that activated for you, bearing in mind that it does work with certain CRS vendors currently. We can also see on the screen, moving on to the next subject, our available rooms. So we have this row here with our available rooms listed. This is very useful when we're looking at things like compressed dates and we want to set our pricing strategy, perhaps our restrictions based on what dates are becoming compressed. So this row on top will show you the overall availability for your property. If we look at different views, however, if I look at room types, for example, and show all room types, this will also show me how many rooms I have available per room type for each given date. And I can toggle this off and on with the show availability toggle on the top of the screen. If I want to see that or not see that, that'll become visible or invisible based on that selection. So again, this is useful to see how many rooms do you have available per room type. And as those room types get compressed, we can actually go into a specific room type and perhaps fluctuate the price points for that particular room type. How do we actually fluctuate price points for particular room types? That's a great question. I'm glad I asked it. Let's take a look. I'm going to navigate over to rates here. We'll keep the date range the same, and I'm going to go ahead and choose my standard daily rate. I have a lot of rates that are derived from my standard daily rate. So by fluctuating this, those will fluctuate based on the changes that I make to it. So I'm going to show my standard daily rate. And here we have our grid. So along the left-hand side of the screen, I have my room types, and along the top, I have my dates. You can see where the value is in black. This is actually picking up from the base rate amount that was configured on the rate itself. Where the rate has been overridden in the rate manager, you'll see that this gold color with a star icon has appeared. That's saying that we've actually gone into this particular date and we've overridden these values. So this is where we're doing our price point fluctuations based on compression, based on demand. We can go in and change particular room types on particular days, or we can fluctuate an entire day all at once. So let's say we're on today's date and we wanted to just simply increment all of our room types by $20. How could we do that? Very simply, we can just click into our tab here and go into all room types. If you don't have hierarchy restrictions in place, you will just simply have the all room types option at the top of your screen. You won't need to click into the tab there. That will just be available for you directly. But we can go into our all room types here. And this is where we can go ahead and adjust the price. So I can say, for example, plus 20 for single and double occupancy. And I can set that. And what that's going to do is increase all of my room types by 20 across the board. And you'll see that that color has updated just as we expected. Now let's say that I wanted to specifically work on my standard queen. I have 8 available right now. We see the availability on the left-hand side. And let's say I want to make my standard queen $219 on weekdays only, and we want to make it $299 on weekends through the end of April. How can we do that? Fairly simple to do. So I've got $219 in here right now. So I can apply this price to each day of the week, except for my Fridays and Saturdays, until the end of April. And just by clicking set, it's going to go ahead and push that out through the date ranges we've selected. Notice that it's skipped over the weekends as we expected because we didn't select Fridays and Saturdays. If I want to set my price point for Fridays and Saturdays, I can just go into the first Friday here. And I think we said $299 was going to be our price point for single and double. And again, I'll apply that price to my Fridays and Saturdays through the end of April. And we can go ahead and set that way too. So that's how we can impact a specific room type and fluctuate the price point. Again, you can go into an individual room type on an individual day if that particular room type is compressed and modify the price point there. These fluctuations or changes in price will integrate with your CRS and then be distributed to the different online partners too. So the changes you make here will reflect in your CRS so long as the rates are linked. This is also useful for seasonal pricing. If you have seasonal rates, for example, you can actually build a base rate and then set your seasonality using the rate manager. As you saw, we did to the end of April here. We could easily have done that through the end of the year or for however far our rate is actually built to go out. Now let's take a look at our cell limits. So our cell limits we find under our revenue management menu. And with cell limits, this is also something that we can activate for you or you can activate for yourself within the property. We do want to bear in mind that this is something that also is supported only with specific vendors currently. So if you do want to use cell limits in partnership with your CRS, this is currently supported with Synexus, iHotelier, Windsurfer, and SiteMinder. And what we can do in here is we can basically modify our availability for each room type for a given date. So there's a couple of different examples I want to show here. The first example is how we might want to strategize from a revenue perspective on the day for the day, let's say. So let's say for today, I know, and we're not actually very compressed today at all, but let's say that we know that we're not going to sell our junior suites today, but we want to overbook our standard kings. We want to basically bump the inventory that we have for our junior suites into our standard kings because these are going to sell, but the junior suites are not. Obviously, we could change our price point for the junior suite, but if our intention is to oversell the standard king and upgrade complementary to the junior suite just so that we reach our occupancy of 100%, then this is a way that we can do that within the system. So we can offset basically. And the way that we can do that is simply go into here. So we have 5 junior suites that we basically want to sell as standard kings. And I can go in here into my standard king box and I can say, I want to add 5 and we'll set the limit. And you'll see now that that's incremented up to 12 total available for sale. But to offset that, what I want to do is go into my junior suites and I'll want to decrement that by 5 to make sure that we're not selling those. Set limit -5 brings it down to 0. So overall, we have the same number of rooms available for sale. We're just selling them as standard kings instead of as junior suites. So that's an option from a strategy perspective that you might want to look at. Overall, we have 41 available for the day, but we've just bumped the inventory around basically. Now, if I actually take a look at my availability screen, and if we take a look at, let's take a look a little further out into April. So on April 15th, you'll see that we're actually sold out currently. We have 0 rooms available. I have a group block that's coming in on that particular day, but I might want to oversell because perhaps we're expecting some wash, some attrition from that group. So we want to actually manage that in advance and oversell some room types. So how can we do that? Very simple for us to do. I'll simply choose the date in my selection here. So we can go to April 15th. And you can see I've already been playing around in here a little bit. I've got some things set to 0. But if we wanted to, let's say, have 3 rooms that we wanted to oversell, how can we facilitate that? So let's say we wanted to oversell standard queens. I can go into here and I can set my room type value as 3. And now we have 3 rooms available for selling. Now, the caveat that I'd like to point out here is that from the PMS perspective, if you want to have these rooms available in the PMS, so not the CRS, but the PMS, if you want them to be bookable in the PMS, if I go to the 15th of April right now, let's take a look at this, and I click Find Rooms and Rates, I don't see any availability, and that's because in order to actually make this bookable, I do have to add to the house limit. I have to add here however many rooms I would like to sell. So in this case, we'll make it 3 just to match. So we'll set the limit to 3. And so we've overbooked the room type by 3, but we're also allowing us on the PMS level to book those 3 rooms. So now if I do that same search, and now you'll see if I go into my standard daily rate that we have 3 standard queens available for sale. So logically, if you think about it, what you could do here is you can set the overall availability to 3 from the PMS, but you can set 3 in multiple room types and then allow 3 to be picked up at the PMS level as a total. So this is restricting how many overall can be booked in the PMS, but from a room type level, you can make it available across different room types. A caveat to that to be aware of, however, is that from a CRS perspective, when you do allow overbooking on room types, they will see availability by room types, not by house. So when we set a house limit, this does not communicate to the CRS. There's no interface for house limits to CRSs. This is purely for the PMS itself. So if you do overbook 3 standard queens here, that will communicate to the CRS. If you overbooked 3 Parkview queens also, that would also communicate to the CRS, leaving you open for 6 rooms. So that's just something to bear in mind. But this is a great way for you to be able to shift inventory around so you can really set a great selling strategy and also allow you to oversell your property if that's part of your revenue strategy too. Another thing that we've recently introduced to the system to help us with our revenue strategy is our events. So if you were eagle-eyed when we first went into our rate manager, you might have noticed something across the top of the screen. Let me go ahead and pop that date range in there again. So here across the top of the screen in these dates, we have this blue outlined box with 1, and that's indicating to me that I have 1 event for the date range that we have selected right now. And if I click in here, it's going to show me what that event is. It's Chicago Restaurant Week, which is currently ongoing until April 4th, it looks like. So that's great for us to see things that are happening in the city, things that are happening in your region. You can put in public holidays, you can put in a whole host of different events. And you'll notice that this says external event. You can have internal events, public holidays, external events. So lots of useful things that you can record in there. And again, that's going to be great when you're setting your price point strategies. Why are you compressed over these dates? It's because you have an event going on. You can click in here and see exactly what it is. So how do we set these events? Simple enough to do. Under our revenue management menu, we have events. And this is where we can add them. So we have all event types. We can toggle between the different event types if we have a whole host that makes it complicated to look through. And we can also filter through date ranges too. Let's go ahead and add an event now. So I'm going to add Chicago Jazz Festival, which I think unfortunately has been canceled this year, but nonetheless, we're going to add it. And that's in September 3rd to the 6th. And we'll add the event. Oh, a description. Oh, I need my event type, my apologies. But we could also put in a description in here. Festival may cancel, something like that. And then this would be either a public holiday, an external event, or an internal event if it's something within the property itself. So let's say external event. We'll add the event. And now in our rate manager, if we pop along to September, there we see the event listed for those particular dates, and we can easily click into it and see exactly what's happening over those dates and set our pricing and strategy accordingly. Another thing that's super important for us to be aware of is our contract rates and also our rate sequencing. So as you noticed here, when I was looking through my rates, only a certain number of rates actually displayed here. So I've got 3 rates that are showing in my general rate availability display. And the reason for that is because I'm using rate sequencing. So in the back end of the system, if I go into settings and settings, and under my rates menu, I have rate sequence, which I've activated. So I've created a custom sequence. And in that sequence, if I manage my rates, you'll see here on the left-hand side, I've added the rates that I want to be available for general display. And on the right-hand side, I've left out all of the rates that I don't want my users, my reservations team, my front desk team to see generally. I don't want to clutter my reservations query screen with these rates. And this is a great way for us to do that. But that being said, sometimes you actually need to be able to access these rates, the Expedia rates, corporate tier A, corporate tier B, booking.com, for example. So how do we get those rates visible to be seen when they're generally invisible and not available for us to see? The way that we do that is through our contracted rates. So we associate them with a company or travel agency card, which then allows us to populate that rate and do a rate query. So I have an example that we're going to do here. We're going to actually create a company contract for Google, and we're going to associate our corporate tier B rate with Google. So they'll get our corporate tier B, and then we can go ahead and verify that that's working and make a reservation. So step 1 for this is to navigate to our revenue management menu option, and under company and travel agency cards, This is where we'll have a list of all of our active company and travel agency cards. If I wanted to search for everything that we have in the system currently, I can get a list by putting in 3% signs, which will go out and retrieve everything that's active within the system. Based on how many cards you have, that might take a little while for it to retrieve based on how much is in your database, but that will go ahead and retrieve everything that you have there. So as we said, we wanted to do one for Google. So I'm going to search for Google. And currently I don't have an active card for Google. So I'm going to go ahead and create that by clicking on Add New Card. In this case, it's going to be a company. So I'm going to choose Company Card. The main difference between a company card and a travel agency card is really that travel agency cards tend to be commissionable or can be commissionable, whereas company cards tend not to be. We would populate this with as much information as we can get, our address information, contact information, all that good stuff we would generally fill out here. I'm going to save the new card with very little information. We can also upload an image, generally a company icon or logo or such if we want to, not necessary, but we can. So I can click in here, for example, and I can upload the Google icon and associate that with the company card too. So now that we have this first portion done, I can navigate to my contracts tab. This is the important portion where we link that rate that we discussed to the actual company card itself. So under contracts, it's going to tell me that we don't have a contract currently. So I could link an existing contract if I wanted to basically copy a contract that exists, or I can just create a new contract. And in this case, that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a new contract. So what are we going to call this contract? I'm not going to make it too complicated. I'm going to call it Google. Where we have the access code, this is an indicator when we're doing a rate query as to whether or not there is a contracted rate for this particular entity. So it's not something that interfaces with your CRS. It's not like the promotion code or such that they would use online to book. This is just an internal PMS code that shows that this entity does have a contracted rate. So I'm just going to use Google. Again, we won't make it too complicated. I'll choose my start date of today, and I'll choose an end date of December 31st, 2021. So this is a contract for today, for this year, I should say. We can also add in the number of contracted nights if we know what that's going to be. So if Google have said that they're going to give us a specific number of room nights, we can add this here and it'll even it out for us by month, or we can put in a specific contracted amount per month as indicated by the contract. So if I said that they are going to give us 80 room nights, I can go ahead and push that here and it'll give 80 per month. Maybe that's a little excessive. Maybe it's going to be 10 per month. And we'll say save. You can also associate a contract owner if you have a user that is defined to be a contract owner, and you can include an active users here. Not necessary to do that, so we can skip over that step. Now, the next step is to actually associate a rate with this contract. But in order to do that, the first thing you have to do is save the contract. And it's going to populate information such as the fact that it's a current contract. You could see future and past contracts based on the date ranges that are populated here, the start and end date. But if we scroll down a little here, you can see contracted rate. And this is where we're going to link that rate we were talking about with the entity itself. So this was corporate rate, corporate tier B. You can have as many rates associated with an entity as you need. So maybe they have a corporate rate, maybe they have a last minute rate that's available when you book within a specific booking window and you have restrictions in place. So based on the booking window, you'll see one rate versus the other, or maybe you see three rates and one of them is a prepay rate, one of them is a direct bill rate, one of them is a pay on their own rate. You can have as many rates as you would like. But we're going to go ahead and save changes. What we can also do is in the summary tab, if we wanted to, we could add default billing information. So if we knew that the room and tax was always going to be paid by Google, for example, we could say room and tax will be paid by Google, and we can select a specific payment method here too, such as direct bill, if we knew that they were always going to be paid by direct bill. The only caveat to that, however, is we would need to have an accounts receivable number created for this particular contract or company if we do want to be able to direct bill to them. So someone from our finance team or whoever has permissions would also want to create an AR account too to allow for that direct billing to happen. But our contract is created, and with that in place, we should now actually be able to go ahead and do a search. So if I navigate back to my dashboard, and we click into new, and we're going to stick to our April the 1st date. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go down to company, TA, group, and allotment, and I'm going to start looking for Google. And there you see that little contract sign. You see the Google logo, the contract sign, and the code that we put in, the access code Google, which indicates that there is a contracted rate for this particular entity. It doesn't necessarily mean that the rate is available. It could be restricted, it could be closed, but we do know that there is generally a rate or rates available for this particular entity. So I'll choose Google. We'll click on Find Rooms and Rates. And you'll see that we've gone directly to the Recommended tab. So it's recommending corporate tier B as the contracted rate. Now, if this rate was closed, we could always toggle over to our rates tab and see our general availability. But this is perfect because it's showing the rate that we want to see, which generally we can't see because it's hidden. And then I can expand that out and see my room type availability and go ahead and book this reservation. And as we proceed through, billing information found, our default billing information, we'll apply that to the reservation. And we'll choose our existing profile. Select a payment method and continue. And if we go to the stay card, it's gone ahead and associated it with Google. So we have the production being recorded on Google's card, company card. And we have the correct rate associated with it, as well as the default billing instructions, which we've pulled in from the Google company card too. So that's a nice way for us to keep those rates that we don't want cluttering our general availability screen hidden and only accessible when we actually search for a specific entity like Google, where we can pull that in and see that particular rate code itself. So we can do that with company cards. We can also do that with travel agency cards. And if that's gonna help your team declutter the rate screen, definitely something that's worth looking into. And again, that's under settings and settings, in rates and rate sequence. And you can create a new sequence and then manage the rates within there. And then just make sure for those ones that you want to be able to find or make visible that you have a contract in place to be able to pull that rate up. Things like house use rates, comp rates, for example, you could associate with a company card for your property. Friends and family rates, for example. And then obviously with Expedia, you might want to associate that with the Expedia travel agency card, booking.com, same thing. And then individual corporate rates can be associated with individual corporate entities. So that was a lot of information to go through. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Erin and we can open it up for some questions.
Thank you, Chris, for that insightful presentation. I'd now like to turn over the floor for questions. Remember, you can submit questions through the question box in the middle of the control panel. So our first question is from David. What should we ask support to turn on?
So for the hierarchy restrictions specifically, if you reach out to support and just let them know that you would like to activate hierarchy restrictions and also specify which CRS vendor you're working with, because only certain restrictions are supported based on the CRS partner that you're working with. And if you just include that information, they can get that activated for you and you'll be good to go.
Great. And then from Taylor, is there a way to automatically upload all public holidays without having to build each event one by one?
That is a great suggestion. Unfortunately, at the moment, no, but it's a great idea and definitely something that we can put into our feature request board because that is a good suggestion. I like that. I'm making note as we speak.
All right, I'm not seeing any more questions. I'll give everyone a few more seconds to enter those. All right, we have one from Kasia. For company cards with accounts receivable, does the billing instruction on the company card need to be direct bill in order for reservations to be routed to the AR tab?
It does. You don't necessarily have to default that. If it's not always going to be direct bill, then that's not something you have to default, such as our Google example. If it will occasionally be direct bill, you can set that up on a reservation by reservation basis. But if you know that it's always or almost always room and tax direct bill, then you definitely want to select the corresponding billing group, whatever it might be. And you do want to select in the payment side here on the left-hand side, new payment method, direct bill, and that will default it for you to go to the AR account. It's a great question.
Perfect. Yeah. And then David, can you add events to the availability screen?
That is a great suggestion, and that is something that has been mentioned on the feature request board. So that's something that our development team are aware of and running with, because I think it would be useful not just on the rate manager screen, but also on the availability screen too. So definitely something that we're aware of as a suggestion. So thanks for that. Yeah.
All right, and then Amy asked, is there a way to do tier rates based on occupancy?
That would be more like a strategy. So I think Amy sounds like she's asking if we can close or open based on hitting a certain threshold. That's not something that exists within the PMS. It's generally something that will be handled by a revenue management system. So when you hit a certain threshold, like 80% occupancy, it would trigger things like your friends and family and discount rates to close, for example. So there's no functionality like that baked into the PMS, but with our revenue management partners, we certainly do have functionality like that out there. But if you were just using the PMS standalone, it would be something you'd have to kind of monitor based on your availability and then go in and close those or put those restrictions in place using your availability screen. So from the availability screen here, you'd want to check your occupancy percentage and then just go into your rate manager and put the restrictions in manually if you're not using an RMS.
Great, thank you, Chris. And those are all the questions I see right now. Again, I'll give everyone a few more seconds to enter any questions. All right, since there are no more questions, I'd like to take to the floor to offer some final thoughts. And 1 second. All right. So in this webinar, we discussed the rate manager, including hierarchy restrictions, availability, and setting rate amounts. We discussed cell limits, events, company and TA cards, and contract management. With that, I'd like to conclude our presentation. Thank you all for coming. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to email me at erin.fisher@stayintouch.com. Thanks again.